Hi guys, thanks very much for checking out another episode of Kettlebell Sport Talk. Today I had the massive pleasure of interviewing Chris Peil. Chris is somebody who's been there and done it in terms of competing in kettlebell sport, but over the past few years he's really focused on developing himself as a practitioner in terms of rehabilitation, movement specialist, and really working with some high level athletes, namely some of the world's strongest man, different types of athletes from all walks of life. So I was really keen to get Chris on the show and the podcast, just so I could sort of pick his brains on just his thought process when it comes to movement training and what his thought process was when it came to the full performance spectrum, really. And what I found out from this talk was actually it reiterated everything we'll hear time and time on the podcast, was everything is so individual. Chris lays it all on the line. He's not a big fan of just general approaches. He's really a massive fan of saying, right, if you feel like you need help, so you've got limitations, go out and get some expert help on that. Self-diagnosing isn't always the best way to go. Also talking about how can you really get the most out of a full program if you have certain physical qualities that are going to be letting you down. So we really dig on deep on that, and Chris just goes off on some great rants, and it was just great just to sit back and listen, and I'm sure you guys will get a lot from it as well. But like I say, hopefully you enjoy this, guys. Just as always, remember, subscribe to us on YouTube so you don't miss out any episodes that will be coming every week. So make sure you do click the subscribe button below. Drop us some comments below as well. And if you've got any future recommendations for guests, or if there's any topics that you want us to discuss specifically for kettlebell sport to help your performance, then get in touch. But let's get stuck straight into the episode, guys, and I hope you enjoy. Hi guys, thanks very much for checking out another episode of Kettlebell Sport Talk. Today I am joined by a fantastic movement rehab specialist, but who's also been there and done that when it comes to kettlebell sport as well. Been following his journey over the past few years, and it's been awesome to see his passion just develop to a whole new level, and it's just ended up in working with, you know, just people like the world's strongest man and some of the best athletes on the planet and stuff as well. And the thing that speaks volumes for me is you've got guys who are traveling from literally the length and breadth of the country to spend 2 hours with him, you know. So if somebody's willing to travel from the top end of the country all the way down to Stoke, then he must know what he's talking about. So I'm joined by the one and only Chris Peil. How we doing, mate? How's life treating you?
Good, mate. Thank you. Really, really good. And thank you for the intro.
No worries, mate. Hopefully I did you a bit of justice there, mate. Cool, mate. So, I mean, basically we were having a bit of a chat there, and we were just starting to get into some real good stuff. But, I mean, one of the main reasons I wanted to get you on there is because you've really excelled over the past few years in terms of going into the nitty-gritty of actually getting people moving better for their sport and getting them back up to speed. So I really want just to pick your brains on that. But one thing we were just chatting about there was actually, first things first, what's the starting point, you know? So I'd just love to kick it off there. So when somebody comes to you presents a problem or whatever it may be, what's kind of like your start point for that? How do you sort of dissect everything down and just say, right, actually it's not this, we're looking at this?
That's quite interesting, really, for me, because it's a bit of a tricky one. Because, of course, you become like a little bit known for something specifically. So everyone's like, who contacts me, the vast majority are going, okay, I think I need help with my mobility, and they'll contact you based on that, and then come and see you. And it's interesting because, you know, that's, as we're kind of talking about, one aspect of their overall ability to do anything, their ability to perform, and sometimes that might not actually be where they need assistance, or not in the area that they think they need assistance. So to me, everything needs to be assessment led, and this is one of my issues all around with people posting like generic videos online and generic systems, that if you're not going from an assessment start point, how do you know that you're not actually just making things worse?
Yeah.
So from like a movement perspective, it's not perfect, and things change a little bit under load, and things change when you're fatigued and whatever else. But a simple sort of active range of movement and looking through joint by joint, it can give you an indicator. You know, if somebody's got really limited active range of movement in one joint, basically, like if they've got really limited overhead reach, say, saw a guy just this morning, massively limited overhead reach. The compensation for that is going to be lower back. And generally speaking, what they're going to get is they're going to get problems with the lower back, which quite often will just be basically fatigue related because they're having to do a lot of work at end range with the lower back.
Yeah.
If you go see a therapist, there's a good chance that they're going to spend the time rubbing your lower back. That might be useful in the short term to relieve symptoms, but it's not going to address the problem if you're an overhead athlete, or you're starting to become an overhead athlete. So pretty much that's it for me. You need to be assessment based to start with. But it doesn't always mean that the thing the person's come and sort of self-diagnosed is what they're looking for. And yeah, it does happen. I'll get people come in and say, I come and see you, I think I've got problems with my mobility. And actually, they've got really good range of motion in general. And they might have one little imbalance throwing things off a little bit. Often you'll find that people who pick up more issues actually don't have the least sort of general mobility and flexibility, for want of better terms. They're actually the people who've got a big imbalance. So they've got generally good range of movement, and then one limitation somewhere that they really can compensate for elsewhere. Yeah. And then they overload other structures. But often the other issue is they might just actually be weak. And people don't necessarily want to hear that. You know, you've got a massive lack of stability, you've got a lack of general strength. And kettlebell sport's an interesting one for this as well, because again, you've got people starting a sport because they're interested and they want to compete in sport. And we see this a lot now. This is like the social media generation stuff, isn't it? It's like, I want to identify as an athlete so I can put up on my Facebook profile that I'm an athlete. I want to go to an event and I want to get a medal, and I want to be able to put a picture of me up with a medal. And all that's great. And if people get a lot out of that and enjoy it, brilliant. But it's very difficult to go, actually, I'm 35. I've not done any activity of any real level since I was 16. Yeah. I spent a lot of time in an office, and now I'm going to be an athlete. And I'm going to view myself as an athlete, and I'm going to train like an athlete, or try and train like an athlete. I'm going to contact somebody who will give me a program that is derived from a winning Russian program, and I'm going to follow that. Because you just get into a situation, don't you? It's like, okay, so in fairness, what people need to understand about the difference between a program that's designed to make you win out of a pool of prospective athletes, and a program that's designed to make you better as an individual, completely different. So it's like, if you go, more mainstream sports are an easy one to think of. If you recruit from schools all the people who've got the best potential to be a kettlebell sport athlete, and you decide that in order for them to win at a world championships, they need to get 200 snatches in 10 minutes, and you design a program that starts wherever they're at and it increases incrementally for the period of time that you want it to, say a year, to get them to 200, and you put all the athletes on it, and it breaks 9 out of 10. You're left champion, but you've broken 9 people. That is highly acceptable in professional sport, because that's how you create champions. You're an amateur athlete who's starting out, and you want the best that you can be, whilst also balancing your family life, your work life, generally being able to walk about. Following that same program isn't appropriate for what you're going to do. So quite often with people, when you start talking to them, they've come to you and say, I want to work on mobility. And you'll look at their range of movement, you look at the actual range of movement, you'll look at what is potentially lacking. You'll might have to, the yin to the yang, the stability. Might have to talk to them about, general base strength. But a lot of it will come down to programming. I don't know how much you've looked at like Tim Gabbett's stuff. I reference it all the time. It's like, basically,
use it massively.
Well, it's one of these. If you increase overall workload too fast, you will get hurt, and it doesn't really matter where you're at mechanically for that. So the example I use is probably not the best one, but is if you take a do you remember when you're a kid and you take a ruler and you hang it off the edge of a desk and you twang it and it makes a noise? You've got the ruler outside, which is off the edge of the desk. It's not in a very strong mechanical position. If you lean on it, you'll break it quite easily. If you stand it up and you push down on it, it'll be really hard to break because it's in a strong mechanical position. You're taking a shearing force and making it a compressive force.
Yeah.
You can do the same, essentially. That's what you're doing when you improve somebody's mechanics and you improve their range of motion, so they have to compensate the same and they can get into better positions. You're reducing shear forces in the areas where they're getting issues by moving those angles elsewhere, if you like. That's basically what you're doing. You're improving things mathematically, mechanically. But it doesn't really matter if you then just overload it enough, because eventually, if you overload it, if you just keep going and put too much load on, you'll get a tendinopathy or something anyway.
Yeah.
So, it does have to be holistic. And when you start these conversations with people, you have to, for me, if people are coming with a mind to be rehabilitated, prehabilitated, improve their performance, it's a lot of content in a short period of time. But you've got to try and get a little bit more of a holistic view. And if you're, in some ways, it's a fairly hard sell because people like something that's dead easy for them to understand. What's the best? What should I do? What's the best exercise for me to improve overhead? And if you get somebody who's a complete fucking dimwit who just goes, the best exercise for overhead is this. Actually, that gets a lot of traction online, gets a lot of traction on Facebook and YouTube because it's easier to understand than if you say, when you say the best exercise, what do you mean by that? Nobody wants to hear that necessarily.
Yeah.
So for me, the main thing comes down to people turn up with their own preconceived ideas of what they want you to do. And it's just, it's not getting some sort of argument telling people they're wrong. That's not the idea, but it's trying to get a little bit deeper than that and say, okay, well, more holistically, if you're trying to perform better and you're trying to not avoid getting injured, there's different aspects to that. And to be honest, more with the strength guys, actually, that I've worked with, a lot of it does involve some politics and having to be a little bit careful. Again, 'cause a lot of people are working with a strength coach who isn't me, certainly not me, and are already being programmed a certain way, and potentially, where possible, communication with that person so that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah.
And trying to balance those things out. I am a little bit lucky on that front. A lot of the guys I'm getting a pretty high level, and their coaches are already really quite good. So intrinsically, what they're doing is quite sensible progressions of load. And actually, then all I have to do is try and improve things mechanically a little bit. We do get some nice positive results out. It's more difficult when you get the athletes who are looking after themselves and they're doing their own programming because, well, without being a dick, a lot of the time that's at a slightly lower level. And worse than that, even if they're massively talented at programming for other people, program for yourself, as we both know, is an absolute nightmare because you overthink it and you disregard the things that you don't like anyway. And you tend to, one of the things that I like, and it's one of the things that I've talked to Abby a lot about, is trying to find different ways to assess where you're at in terms of like auto-regulation. So she uses HRV. I've used that with a few athletes. There's a couple of other methods that are out there and get used in terms of saying, okay, well, actually, where are you at readiness each day before you train, so you can adjust what you've written on the paper so that it's not going to hurt you. But by the same token, the flip side of that, and this is something that I think is useful for people who program for themselves, the flip side of that is if you feel a bit tired one day, I feel a bit tired, I might back off my sets. And actually, whatever you're using to give you that biofeedback of where you're at auto-regulation wise says, actually, you're fine. You then have to have a word with yourself and say, right, stop being a pussy. Now I have to do the sets. I have to do them at the level that's on the paper.
Yeah.
It can run both ways. Sometimes it's saying, actually, no, you are run down. You need to back off. You might need to do 80% of what's on the paper. So you're still doing some general, high quality work, but you're not putting yourself into that position where you're likely to get either ill or injured off the back of it. So
that's really interesting. I mean, that's something we've discussed quite a bit on the podcast with me and Simon about the way I structure training now is there's always generally two or three development days depending on the level of the athlete. So that's kind of like, if you look at RPE scale, that's like a 9 out of 10. And then the 2 days of generally like 7 to 8 out of 10. And then there's a 6 or 6 below. And then it's given people the options, that fluidity, depending on their HRV. And we use the jump mat as well, because vertical jump, CMJ,
that's one of the other measures,
is absolutely fantastic for saying, are you ready to train or you're not? It's kind of like
that's why I love it, that alongside the HRV, because I think the variables there where you can either jump high or you can't. The body will either let you do something or it won't, you know? And there's been a few times when I'm in that exact situation, HRV's gone like, oh yeah, you're good to train. And I'm like, yeah, but I still feel kind of tired. Jumped on the jump mat and it's been like 62, 63, right on my level or a little bit above. And it's like, yeah, have a word with yourself. And then actually started warming up and it was probably one of the best sessions I've had, you know? But yeah, I think it's really important that giving people that flexibility to be able to sort of alternate that load. I've had it in the past where it's kind of like, no, it's written down on Wednesday, you've got to do this. So you've got to do it. And it's quite easy to get into that mindset as an athlete, especially as an online student and stuff as well. It's like, oh, well, coach said I've got to do it on this day. But it's educating them and just saying, listen, if the markers are saying this, just swap that for a green day. That's not a problem. Leave your ego.
That's really, really nice. And this is something that came across being done. It's actually my wife does this.
Yeah.
My wife, bless her, she was in the lightweight class of British Strongest Woman a couple of years ago. She competes at a pretty good level strength wise, and she is strong. Pound for pound, she's massively stronger than I am. One of those things where she has a stressful job, and this is the thing about like recreational athletes. She is at a good level, but a lot of the girls she competes against don't have the same level of stress in their day jobs because they might be not the main earner in their household or whatever, and they've got a little bit more flexibility with their work, or a lot of them are actually personal trainers. And they've got a little bit, they're already at the gym, they've got less travel time, they're already immersed in that, and it's less of a problem for them to get the training in. They can work around it much better, they can plan their own diary. So she, and I'd never really seen it before, certainly not at a decent level, she's incredibly flexible with what she does training-wise, and she'll do that. She'll flip around and go, right, I've done a lot of travel today, or I'm tired because of where I've been sent work-wise. What I'll do now is I'll do an upper body session, not either my squat based or my deadlift based sessions, and I'll move those to where I've got. So she changes it in a way that for a lot of people, me included, you'd find quite challenging because you like fixed structure and routine, way to sort of make things work. And I think, it is an interesting concept. I like the jump mat as well, because that gives you, certainly for full body stuff like kettlebell sport, that gives you a slightly different indicator as well, isn't it? The HRV is giving you like a systemic indicator. That's giving you, to some degree, yes, systemic nervous system, but also potentially some localized muscular fatigue aspects as well. You're not getting that of HRV, so it's a nice complement. With a lot of guys, I've used like 3-4 different measures and tried to track trends, and that's difficult, but because you need the athlete to buy into it and to actually track their own, because there's just not enough time in the day and resource for you to track it on their behalf, unless they're like a residential athlete at a professional sports club. But this is all the stuff that we're looking at, sort of increasing what we do based out of Strength Asylum on this basis, to try and get this. Basically, when I did the sports med masters, I was a bit of an outsider all around, because one, I was from a personal training background, not a therapy or medical background. I wasn't interested in being employed in elite sport, whereas everybody else was either employed in elite sport or wanted to be employed in elite sport. Well, I'm old and I'm grumpy, and I don't want to be taken away by a sports club every weekend to, that's not what I want. That's things like that in my life in the past, in other areas where you have to do that. I don't want that. So that wasn't my motivation for it. But these guys had the resource they had, and how much it opened my eyes was just incredible. And what they could do, there's a guy there who worked at Everton as a physio, and what he had available to him was absolutely incredible. And what we were sort of thinking about here is how, if you're in the sort of private sector, if you're an individual athlete, you're in a sport that doesn't have any funding, or you're in a sport that does have funding, but it only has it if you're a medal hope, which is the most ridiculous fucking concept in the world. Where do you access that if you want it? Because we've got loads of people who treat themselves like they're an elite athlete, but can't get the support an elite athlete gets. And that's the gap that we want to bridge business-wise here in Stoke, and go, right, do you know what? We're already getting people traveling nationwide to do some of the stuff that I'm already offering, that is actually bridging that gap between therapy and training which should be really obvious, but gets ignored. And what more can we add to it? It is things like you're talking about, different ways to monitor fatigue, different ways to try and improve recovery, which is another interesting subject. Different ways we can actually try and optimize athletes, and actually not hurt them, and try and get that mentality for certain people who are in control of their own training to some extent, or paying somebody to do training individual to them. Training will optimize them and fulfill their potential, not break them. And it is that thing that's how that's different to just doing the training that would make you a champion. You know, I could write a program tomorrow that gets me to be, to beat Denisov. I could write that program tomorrow. If I followed it, I'd break, and I break fast. And we see that a lot. You know, that's part of the sport, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So going back to that then, mate, and I just want to, so obviously people self-diagnose problems, and hell, I've done it many a time in the past. I mustn't be this, or I mustn't be that. But one thing I've looked at recently is kind of efficiency of movement, because ultimately, if you're inefficient, then you could be the strongest person in the world or the fittest person in the world, but if you can't be efficient with that movement, the metabolic cost of that is going to be huge. Do you know? But one thing I want to sort of pick you on is, obviously some people might come and say, oh, Chris, I've got poor mobility, and you go, right, okay, you do your tests. What other tests do you do apart from the range of movement stuff? Do you sort of then say, well, actually, let's have a look at your strength? And if so, what sort of test do you do that? Or do you say, actually, it's just your work capacity, you are strong, you're just not fit enough to sustain that? Have you sort of got like a test battery that you use with your guys across the board?
Again, that comes down to the specific athlete, really, and what you would do. So, again, some of it comes down to what you've got available to you equipment-wise. And some of it comes down to down to the athlete. And what I would say about that is that's quite an interesting area, again, because what we tend to do, because it's just, I guess it's human nature, and you see it I saw it a lot again on the Masters. People like to go, right, well, I'll put together a generic battery for everyone. And that has some benefits, certainly with the sporting team, because you can compare everyone. And you can go, okay, I've got the sports team. I've got, a squad of 30 players. I can put everyone through the same thing. But it is kind of irrelevant. And what you get around to is, okay, it gives you some ideas of baselines. But if you've got a goalkeeper, what does he need to be doing relative to the guy who's centre midfield and has to cover all the distance? Why are we doing the same test for them? And if we do the same tests, do we apply the same interventions based on the outcome? Almost definitely not. So even then, some of the tests might change. Now, for me, I've got that luxury where they're an individual, they come in. A lot of things can be established from essentially your interview, I suppose, at the start. What are the needs? What are they finding? And that way, because you're limited for time, that's your most limited resource, working the way I do, you can only test the things that you think from what they've said are relevant. And an awful lot of it, you're not going to test in person anyway. Some of it down to equipment limitations. It's not like I've got an IKD machine, so I can't do that. And some of it comes down to actually the practicalities of it. If I want to know, if I want to know somebody's general work capacity, where it fits in their training, I can't write their training off by doing some testing that's fatiguing. That's not part of my role. But simple things like saying, what do you do conditioning wise? Okay. And if you use the rowing machine, what kind of numbers are you hitting on that? So you see quite a lot of people will post what they're doing with their assistance work on the rowing machine, and it's easy to compare. And you can look at some people from within the Kettlebell Sport small community, and we've all got mutual friends on Facebook and whatever else. You see some people punch stuff up and they've got an absolutely massive work capacity based on what they're doing on a row machine. So you can actually go, do you know what? Just based off that, I don't need to test you for your general,
work capacity,
your general work capacity is there for you. Actually, again, I'm not saying don't do it and don't maintain it, but going further down that route maybe isn't the best use of your time. And isn't, you might be getting down to the point where that might actually start causing you some problems when there's other things that are glaring errors. There's guys who can't actually lock out a single rep overhead with massive work capacities. The time better spent looking at positions, because like you say, the amount of energy you're using having to hold a position that's really not ideal overhead, rather than trying to actually balance that out by having a greater work capacity, you need to balance it out by actually being able to get a more efficient, better position.
Yeah.
And that, that's exactly what we're getting at, isn't it? It's like for the individual, it might not all be direct testing a standardized battery of tests, but it's having in mind what can you find out from them to show you where their limitations are.
Yeah.
And it's simple. If the tables are out there, they're easy to find, and they're not the be all and end all. But if you've got somebody comes in and you say to them, so, assistant strength work, do you do any? Not really. How strong have you ever been? Have you ever barbell squatted? Yeah, I did a bit. What was the most you did? Oh, I never got up over like 80 kilos. What's your body weight? 110. Right. Okay. And this is one of the things, you straight away like, okay, so your base strength is poor. Your base strength is really poor. There's the argument out there that you shouldn't be doing anything explosive. Kettlebell sport, explosive, and it doesn't have an eccentric component, particularly in the same way that our lifting doesn't have an eccentric component, particularly in terms of muscle mass. It has a very connective tissue, stressful eccentric component in terms of absorbing the force. It has that kind of eccentric component. It's slightly different, isn't it? Than the eccentric component of bodybuilding to grow muscle, not there, which is why you don't like a bodybuilder. But the eccentric component in a absorbing force sense, definitely there, definitely having your connective tissues. If you don't have a body weight and a half squat or thereabouts on a barbell, again, you've got to be a bit careful with just blanket figures like that, because obviously slightly different for men and women, and obviously your actual technique, how far you're actually moving that load, there's a lot of different things involved, and some people find it very difficult to get into a squat position with a barbell, and they shouldn't just be forced to do that just because
the papers say so.
Exactly, yeah. But the concept is true. If they've got a big trap bar deadlift, for example, relative to their body weight, they're strong. Whether or not they're very good at barbell squatting or not doesn't matter. They are strong, and they're probably appropriate for them to start doing explosive work, repetitive explosive work. Because it's an amateur sport, we do definitely have a big pool of recreational athletes who are not actually conditioned to start doing what they're doing, and that's probably why we have issues with certain injuries being repetitive injuries with people relatively early on, because in fairness, chronic type injuries, they're just not really strong enough, and it happens when people start trying to go up the weights. They're going to find it difficult because the base strength just isn't there.
It's I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, it's one thing that I've been lucky over the years with, obviously, my guys in my club and stuff. Obviously, that face-to-face has a massive it helps massively, doesn't it? If you see somebody day in, day out, you can measure all of that. One thing that I've started doing with the online guys is, because there's what's the gold standard, and then sometimes you just need to reverse engineer or just try and get as close to it as possible, and online is always a difficult one. But what I tend to do is get people through a general movement screen, like a movement dynamics type Kelvin Giles type stuff. Then they'll just do some basic physical qualities, even stuff like, as old school it is the McCloy fitness test, because the simple fact is testing upper body strength in terms of pull-ups, testing max press-ups, squat thrusts, squat jumps in a minute, and then basically they'll do sort of like a work capacity or like a 2.4K run test, just as a generic thing. But
I think if you work with people at distance, I think that's absolutely fantastic. And I think that's something that's probably missing a lot of the time, and finding those things out. I'd have no issue with that. And like you say, always basic. It's like the point isn't the test, and the point isn't to get good at a trick that's a test. The point is to get an indicator for you to work from. That's all that matters.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's sometimes it's kind of like, actually, what is your start point? I think, and like you say, people don't sometimes like that, because it's kind of like, I just want to crack on and get it done, But sometimes you do need to rein it back and just say, actually, we need to understand where your baseline is, and we can sort of build from that. and then drive up from that, you know. And as a coach, it makes you more informed, and you know that you're actually improving the things that go into. And the thing is in obviously kettlebell sport, and to be fair, general most weekend warriors type people, most dedicated people on the planet, but actually your main focus is being able to walk up and down stairs and pick up your children and run around and have fun. So actually, I just want to make you better at pretty much everything. And if I make you better at pretty much everything, then your passion and hobby will generally improve as well. Do you know? I think sometimes it's too easy to go mega.
I mean, we've got them here. You've got there's a guy who works out at this gym, and will do things that do have value, and they do have value, but they really are the icing on the cake, and they're a tiny fractional percentage. And the amount of time spent focused on that seems to be completely disproportionate to the amount of time spent just doing good, honest work within ranges the person can do. And a lot of the time for me, assessment with it's different if you've got to get into certain positions. Overhead in kettlebell sports, relatively extreme position, so you need to help people get into that and be able to do that with a relatively low risk. But for a lot of people, you sort of general fitness wise, and again with the like GPP, you might just use your assessments to just establish, okay, barbell squatting for this person isn't necessary for the sport particularly, and actually is really difficult for them and is putting them at risk. So rather than just spending forever in a fucking day trying to teach them to barbell squat for some nominal reason because for your ego, stick them on a trap bar, get them to build some actual capacity in a movement that will have just as much, if not more, crossover that they can do with relatively low risk, and just get on with it. Do you know what I mean? You've got to get the balance right of just getting work done, the icing on the cake. And I see guys like saying here, they're trying to ice a fucking cake they've not even bought the ingredients for. Got clients who aren't getting strong and have never got strong, and it's like, you've got to actually do the work. And sometimes all your assessments are about, and that's even like, when people are coming to me saying they specifically want to improve range of movement, you're saying, okay, but whilst you're improving that range of movement, let's use the assessments to just rule out a few movements that are going to cause you problems and replace them with things that aren't, so you can keep your baselines going up. And then as your range of movement improves, we can get that to cross over to some degree. That comes with its own problems, because again, you put somebody who's now massively conditioned in a potentially a new position, but there's all the things that go with that. It's another whole big subject, isn't it?
Yeah, defo, mate, defo. So when you've obviously a client and stuff, and obviously you're looking at kind of those baselines and stuff, what's the main thing that you try and emphasize and get across to those guys? Do you sort of say, right, okay, your baseline measurements or baseline physical attributes, we want to just get your strength up, and we want your aerobic conditioning or whatever, however you want to term it, we want that up, we want your mobility up. What's kind of the main pillars of
in fairness, generally for me, that's not the way the conversation goes, because generally for me, they're coming to me for some specific specialist advice on an aspect. So they're saying, I want to improve range of movement because I think I need to, and I want to potentially rehab this issue or whatever. And that is where my focus will be, because that's what they've asked for. But at the same time, it's taking that more holistic view and saying, right, but the underlying factors are, and you need to go back and speak to your coach about, do I need to send you an email with what I think for your coach, so you can have the discussion about where you're at in terms of overall loading, how fast that's going up, whether you need to, in your assistance work, maybe substitute this for this in the short term whilst this improves. That stuff is the holistic stuff. So by its nature has to be a little bit secondary to me, to what they're actually asking me for specifically. So I'm not sending people away and saying, no, I'm not helping you with the thing you've come to me for. More that when we're looking at active range of movements, they might come to me and say, I've got a back problem, and I'm saying, actually, the only thing that works is your back. Your back sucks. It is the only thing that works. Everything else is limited. So we need to improve ranges elsewhere. And this is where, from the testing we've done, the priority, and in the context of what you do, the priorities appear to be. And that's it. It's like individual solutions and interventions. And don't get me wrong, you might have quite a big crossover. You might have a lot of the same stuff for a lot of the same people in the same sport, because there's things that are intrinsic to that sport. Again, kettlebell, rack position, overhead position. But it is still individual based on that person's history, based on that person's individual needs, their job, their actual individual biomechanics, their genetic build, those things are still individual, and obviously there's variations on everything. So I'm not a huge fan of generic interventions for those, because you can't, by definition, there is no context for those.
Yeah. So so basically, just for our listeners, some of them might be self-trained or train alone and stuff. Obviously, kettlebell sport, we're not blessed with kettlebell gyms on every single corner of every single town and city going. So the guys who are possibly listening to this and going, right, well, I kind of train by myself, I self-program. What would you say to those guys in terms of they might not have access to yourself and other coaches around? What would you say? Listen, just sit down and score yourself out of this, or would you try and say, I know it's specific to you, but try and do a bit of a reflective practice on where you currently feel your fitnesses are? What would you sort of give to those guys? I know it's quite a vague question. I know it's very difficult.
That's tricky.
Simplification.
I would honestly say in that situation, the sooner you decide whether you actually want to progress or not, and the sooner you decide whether you are prepared to invest and get some help, better. Because in fairness, I don't see a huge amount of value in I can't point you to a system that I can think of that's available online, if you like, that is particularly helpful from my side of things. The fitness testing stuff is different because, as you've alluded to there, you can find results for, what at my gender, age, body weight should I be able to lift? What is, beginner, intermediate, advanced types of numbers? You can find all those things out, and you can do that if you want to do that, and that will be helpful. For the sort of pre-habilitative type of view and the movement efficiency and range of motions, that's different. And the reason that's different, and you probably do need individual help, is intrinsic to the nature of it. Because the way your brain works, and all of our brains works, is if somebody says to you, reach overhead, you focus on the outcome. So you get your hands overhead into the position they need to be in. And the vast majority of people will be able to get, if you put something hanging from the ceiling, if it's a light bulb hanging low enough, they will be able to get to it. But from which joint they're doing that, and from what proportion of which joint they're using to do that, is going to be different. So self-testing range of movement is intrinsically difficult because we compensate, and we compensate because you're like acute dominant, if you like. So the way I think about it and the way I try and explain it to people is, if you were a caveman and you needed to get away from a saber-toothed tiger, your brain doesn't give a shit what your body is like. It goes, right, get away from the saber-toothed tiger. And if that means you're using a compensation because at the moment that's the fastest way for you to move, that's what you do. So we are short-term dominant over long-term because we need to survive. The problem we've got now is that generally most of us aren't in acute danger on a day-to-day basis. We live an awful lot longer than it's likely we were ever really meant to. And we do a lot of sort of repetitive things. Basically, you then run into chronic problems that would never have been a chronic problem. So we're not sort of intrinsically wired up to avoid the compensations that cause us long-term problems. So in the light bulb example, if you're reaching up overhead, and I would like to see you do that with without a massive amount of lumbar spine movement, so for want of a better term, your lumbar spine stays relatively neutral, you're going to have pretty good hip extension to get your pelvis into a decent position to start with, so your lumbar spine's pointing in the right direction from the bottom to begin with. You're going to have good thoracic extension, you're going to have good upward rotation of the scapula, and you're going to have good shoulder joint, well, both rotation and flexion. That's glenohumeral joint. So essentially you've got a few different areas there that you should have a reasonable range of movement. If you 10% of hip extension, you've got a 10% deficit, if you like, straight away before you even start, and you're going to have to find that from somewhere else, probably lumbar spine predominantly. If you've then lost another 10% in terms of thoracic extension, well, you've got another 10% then that's going to come out of lumbar hyperextension. So you can get into the overall position in the short term that you might want to get into, but you're not getting into it in the way that would be ideal. And then obviously over time, you might start to develop symptoms out of your lower back and think there's a problem there when there isn't. Problem is hips and thoracic spine. So if you get somebody to self-test, it will be nigh on impossible for anyone to self-test and not use their existing compensations, because there's too many movements going on. It becomes really, really hard. So, I mean, there's basic stuff you can do. Can you sit on the floor cross-legged? No. You've got a bit of a problem. Can you touch your, one under, one over, touch your hands behind your back? No. Okay, that indicates you've probably got a bit of an issue upper body-wise. Simple things like that. They are integrated movements, but if you're struggling to do them, then you probably have got a range of movement problem. You probably have got a situation where you might want to seek help. Yeah. What I wouldn't do is say you can't do those things, so do this. That's the YouTube interventions where it's like, okay, but what you've got to understand about anything that you might, again, it's not necessarily the best term, but anything you might deem corrective is for it to be corrective, it needs to be done correctly. If you have an existing compensation, the likelihood is your brain's still going to want you to do the corrective movement in the way that is incorrect. So it is very, very difficult without quite a good level of understanding to deal with these things. And this is my issues with things like, do yoga. Yoga is based on outcomes. So if you think about the light bulb example of reaching overhead, it's the same thing. You're trying to get into a pose that is integrated with numerous different aspects. So you will use the bit that works well, and you will continue to use that. And the bit that doesn't work so well, most likely is still going to end up lagging behind. So you might improve overall ability to get into a gross external position, but for the vast majority of people who have significant problems, they are going to encourage improvement from their better areas more so than their worse, which isn't improving balance, which is problems over time. You've still got, I saw a lady Sunday morning who had injured herself doing bloody yoga because she was trying to force herself into the position. And again, this is difficult to explain without having a reasonable understanding of the shoulder complex. But basically, she's trying to get into a position where her arms are up overhead, and her shoulder rotation was poor. So by trying to force herself into that gross overall position, she'd actually really significantly irritated the glenohumeral joint. Well, the muscles around the glenohumeral joint. It's not got this magical quality that people associate with the bloody word. It's not there, that mystical quality. You're basically doing a passive, an integrated passive stretch. That's what you're doing. So if I called it that, you wouldn't get a boner and suddenly think you need to come and do this. It's not something magical. And actually, if we look at evidence, actual real evidence done by like scientists, if anything, it increases injury risk, doesn't reduce it. Because what you are doing is you're getting closer to the end range of a joint where it is at its most vulnerable, and you're not actually necessarily improving stability there at the same time, because there isn't really that activation component at that end range. So in really simple terms, aren't actually necessarily that scientifically accurate, but it can aid understanding. Just making muscles longer does mean that the muscle is less likely to get to its sort of end range, which means you are probably less likely to sort of tear that muscle in general use. There's a bit more to it than that, and it's not an absolute, but generally speaking, that's probably going to happen. But by doing so, by making the muscles longer, you allow the joint that it affects to get closer to its end range. So the ligament structure that holds that joint together is then more likely to take more load, and that ligament structure is more likely to get injured. So you get yang. Do you want muscle injuries or do you want joint injuries? Which one? So the only solution then is to actually get a better balance across the whole body. So for integrated movements, you have a better balance and you have it spread across the joints in a better way. And you are stable and strong through those range of movement that you've got. So it's more holistic than just going, I'm just going to force myself into that position that's largely like what I think from what that guy's doing. That isn't a thing. So you're unlikely to find anyone who's more of a proponent of doing integrated movements for their core training than I am. The stuff that's actually there, and it's massively important. In fact, it's arguably the most important stuff, which is there to actually get a physical adaptation, where you work hard enough to create enough stress to get a physical adaptation, which is how you get better. That stuff needs to be big, full body, integrated movements, lots of muscle mass, or you're not going to get enough stress as an organism to get good adaptation. What you need to consider is, in order to get good integrated movement, if you've got one joint in isolation not capable of the ranges needed to, that is going to upset that movement. So you probably need to identify that one in actual isolation, which involves identifying what it is, identifying what the limitations are, and probably addressing it to some degree in isolation, not in integration. Because by trying to address it in integration, as we've said, you're going to get the other stuff to compensate for it. That's what will happen.
No, mate, that's awesome. That's awesome, because I think it just goes to show the complexity of it, and I think it's quite easy to get sucked into kind of, I've got to do ROM1, or I've got to do kind of this daily YouTube stretch and stuff like that, And I think the biggest lesson for the learners there is, if you think you've got a problem with your mobility or range of movement and stuff, just go and see somebody who's a specialist in that area and get a real good personalized approach to it. Do you know what I mean? Because I think it's something and going down being too general, I suppose, if that's the right message I've got there, mate.
You see this at a high level. I had in my old gym, I had a guy who was a Scottish champion as an ollie lifter, I'm going to improve ability, so I've joined ROMWOD. And you walk out, and the issues that this guy actually had as an ollie lifter, which are quite significant if you're ollie lifting, which is all about hip extension. He had limited hip extension, and he had excessive lumbar spine extension. And you walk out, he's doing like a cobra stretch, and you're like, I'm not sure I'm really helping here. But it's on ROMWOD, so I did it. Okay, that's not really, because you've got to remember as well, and this is the thing, you've got your nervous system, which is in charge. You've got joints, which don't have, so the ligament structure of the joints don't have, contractile qualities, but do have sensory organs within that feed back to the nervous system. And you've got the muscle tendon units that have obviously contractile qualities and have the sensory organs that feed back to the nervous system. So you've got three things there that are interrelated. So if you've got a problem with the joint capsule, and that feeds back to the nervous system won't let the muscles lengthen, not because of a problem with the muscle, but because of a problem with the joint. If you've got the muscle thinking that it's getting into a position that is it's not used to, and it doesn't like under load, and it thinks it might be dangerous, it will feed back to the nervous system, and the nervous system will say, right, stop. It stops you there. So you've got numerous different things that can mean that you get a limited range of movement. And you've got to, and there's no perfect way to do it, but try and identify to some degree what is causing what to happen. And remember that all the time, actually what you're trying to do is retrain the nervous system. So one of the big problems you get with just relying on something like, I'll do yoga or ROMWOD, is you're just kind of hoping that magically crosses over into your integrated movements, because you haven't actually doing that retrained the nervous system. So one of the components of what I try to get across in some of the workshops is that the last aspect of what you do in your warm-up, to me, needs to be something that bridges that gap, where if you've done things to try and improve the range of movement where you're specifically lacking, you're then doing things in your warm-up that then try and get that to cross over well into your integrated movements. And pretty much what this comes down to is, I'm sure a lot of people have come across it, the internal cueing versus external cueing. So when you start doing your actual performance movements, predominantly you want to be thinking about external cueing. So from kettlebell's perspective, you want to be thinking about getting the bells to move in the path you want the bells to move. And it doesn't help if you're having to think a lot about what direction your knees are tracking or things like that, because that's thinking internally about the body. And it throws off your coordination, and it throws off your ability to flow and do things. So you don't really want to be doing that much corrective stuff during your performance sets. what you want to be doing is you want to be doing movements in your, say, your warm-ups, which might even be your sport movements, where you are internally cueing and you're patterning and you're reteaching the nervous system. So the approach becomes, okay, let's actually give you those range of motion that you need and the stability there that you need. Then let's do the practice with the internal cueing where you actually drill those movements, or even if it's indicator movements that aren't the full movement. That's where things like your in kettlebell sport, like your bumps and your paused pause repetitions will come in. You drill those patterns and get the nerve system to learn those, so that when you get into your actual performance sets, you're not thinking about that. And you are just in the movement, and you are flowing with it, and you are just getting on with the actual work.
Yeah,
it's very hard to take just long, slow, static position work like fucking yoga and expect that to just cross over. It might. It gives you the opportunity for that to happen, but to me, that's not really the way that you would optimally do things.
Yeah. No, mate. Yeah, it's so awesome, and I think the biggest takeaway from me there is kind of approach everything like a lasagna. Layer it down, break it down, and yes, it'll form all pieces of the puzzle, but make sure you look at everything on every single individual layer. And if you're not equipped enough, or you don't have an understanding of a certain layer, get somebody to help you with that and get them in a way that's going to make the lasagna tastes bloody good. Do you know what I mean?
And I think the other thing, and the one last kind of thing on that, is when you're actually looking for somebody to help you with things, actually look at what their competency is. What background do they actually have? Because a lot of it, you'd be looking at what results have they got with people. That can be a bit of a red herring, because at times they might have worked with somebody who was already really good. Yeah. And if they start working with really, really good, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were a great coach in their area to get that. What actual improvements and change have they had with people? How consistently have they managed to do that? Their actual formal education, it doesn't make you, absolutely doesn't. But one of my pet hates is this idea of people going, oh, well, I'm from the University of Life, I've got all this experience. Look at these guys, they only got qualified in like 2 weeks. They're shit. So okay, but that is get qualified. Why haven't you done that? There's no excuse for not doing that. On the flip side, the guys who've got all the letters and all the qualifications, if they've never worked with anyone and if they've not actually done anything themselves, well, that'd be a question mark for me. Because I'm thinking, well, you've got no context, you've got no frame of reference, you can't think about how this actually works in the real world. So you're really looking for people who've got a nice mixture of those things and can demonstrate competency, experience themselves, experience with actual clients and success with clients. It really is problematic in kettlebell sport because it's a young sport, and you do see it again in strength sports as well. And I think people should be more discerning buyers actually when they're looking for support and find out from people. A lot of the time you'll get people offering a great deal. Is it a great deal, or is it the fact that actually sometimes what something's worth is what you pay for it? Yeah. And if somebody's offering you for nothing, it isn't really worth anything. We've got some massively talented athletes in the UK. We've got some massively talented athletes who also coach. Some of them have also got very strong academic backgrounds and training in coaching. So you can start to look at it and go, okay, if you break it down, they're really strong across a number of areas. Then you've got some guys who are maybe massively weak in other areas. I had this issue. My formal education was lacking massively. So I spent like tens of thousands of pounds to go back to uni as somebody who's 34 and do more qualification because it was self-development for the area that was my biggest weakness. Yeah. If you're working with somebody and they're not doing that, they're just telling you that it's not important. Well, they're a bellend and they should actually look at themselves and do some self-improvement.
Yeah. Yeah, mate. No, it makes sense. It's one that I've had many a time and discussed with many people. And it's interesting, obviously, my background and chatting to different coaches, because there's so many different ways to become a great coach and different pathways and stuff. Yeah. And I think, but as long as all rivers merge into one, and I think as long as somebody is, however they go about it, as long as it is ticking those boxes in terms of formal qualifications, real-time results, life experience, learning from others that are better around them, then however they get there, it's fine. Like I say, you went the unconventional way. You didn't start university as a spotty 17-year-old who and then went through that pathway. You were like, no, actually, I've got it that way. But actually, look at where you've ended up. Do you know? So I think it's important. You know, I completely agree. Do you know? I think coaching, especially, it's such a personal thing. And again, I think it's trying to find the right coach for you, but doing the due diligence on a coach is always up there. Do you know? It's something that I've always done. And yeah, continue to do so, mate. You know, so mate, honestly, we could probably keep on going for about another 5 hours.
Nobody else would listen, but we'd have fun. Yeah,
I know you've given it your time. Totally appreciate it, mate. I know we've spent a few weeks trying to get this together because you're such a busy guy. But mate, I'm totally appreciative of that. And yeah, if the guys want to get in touch, mate, and reach out to you, what's the best way to do that, mate?
Facebook's probably the best way. So the Move Well Project on Facebook, that page is probably the best way. Or they can have me personally. I don't mind about that either. So that's just Chris Peil.
Yeah, no worries, mate. So yeah, guys, make sure you check out Move Well Project. And Chris has got many workshops, and like I say, I'm sure he doesn't mind having visit him down at Strength Asylum in Stoke as well, mate. But mate, thanks very much for that. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll get to do it again soon, mate.
Yes, mate. Thank you very much.
Cheers.